Welcome to Newsroom Pub. I'm Milwaukee Press Club President Corrinne Hess, and I'm a reporter with Wisconsin Public Radio. I'm so happy to be here today with Charles Franklin. He is the director of the Marquette Law School Poll. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our event sponsors. We have presenting sponsor Spectrum News 1 and our supporting sponsor Re-Energies. I would also like to thank our event partner WisPolitics.com. WisPolitics partners with us as part of an ongoing events series in Milwaukee. It's sponsored by UW-Milwaukee, Wisconsin Academy of Global Education and Training, 1125 at Pabst, Milwaukee Police Association, the Firm Consulting, Medical College of Wisconsin, and Spectrum. Before we hear from Charles, I would like to first welcome our media panel, Charles Benson from TMJ4, Bill Glauber from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and Victor Kogo from CBS 58 and Telemundo. Now, back to Charles Franklin, who yesterday released some very interesting results from his poll. Charles has been director of the Law School Poll since its inception in 2012. Since then, the poll has been recognized as the definitive source of information about public opinion in Wisconsin. We're really excited to hear more. Thank you for being here.
Thank you much. I'm going to give you guys a 2-minute warning because I believe I'm only going to speak for 1 minute. It'll probably take 6, so let's call it 2 minutes. Okay, you did that. I don't think there's much point in going on. I want to make, I guess, 2 main points. And that is, first, that elections across the country, as well as here in Wisconsin, have become increasingly nationalized over the last 10 to 15 or 20 years. If we go back 20 years here, the correlation between presidential and state election results, whether at any level, was about 0.6 on a 0 to 1 scale. Recently, the last year, 2020, it's 0.95, meaning there's just nearly a straight line between national votes and legislative or state level votes. Now those can shift. You can see Tammy Baldwin winning by nearly 11 versus Tony Evers winning by 1. There's a big gap there, but it's not that they shuffled the coalition. It's just that Tammy did better across the board. That straight line simply moved up for her as opposed to Evers, where it was more or less, 1 point. So the idea that in the old days you could carve out a personal brand, a constituency that you were their representative and whether you were a D or an R wasn't that important, has become less and less the case. So one of the big things for 2022 here and everywhere in the country is just how big are those national forces that are shifting that relationship up or down. And to what extent can local candidates affect the shift, pushing it up more or holding it down some, rather than the idea that you might have parts of the state that you would be uniquely well suited to win, or you might have personal relationships if you're a state legislator that can offset that. So I'll be watching this year for that balance between national and local forces, but the national stuff is going to play an awfully big role. The other thing was the big takeaway yesterday in the poll is simply that half of the voters in the primaries haven't made up their minds who they're supporting. And those of us that do this for a living naturally are kind of amazed, though I will challenge folks to name all 11 Democratic Senate candidates. I had to look them up. But really, half of the folks haven't made up their minds. So we have front runners in both races, but with half still on the sidelines not making up their minds. It's just a reminder of how many TV and radio ads still need to run before people start to have a good idea. So I'm going to leave it at that. And I don't know how much over I did.
No, you did a great job there. Well, let's pick up on something you talked about, which is how the national narrative and how national politics can influence state politics. And when you put your eyes then on the U.S. Senate race, which will be watched closely nationally, and we are in that midterm election, the power, the party in power is Democrats. We know in those election years, it does not bode well for the party in power, right? So Democrats. So, but when you look at the U.S. Senate race, and specifically Senator Ron Johnson's numbers, which I think in this most recent poll was the lowest favorable rating for him in your polling. So how does that play out in 2022, knowing what the national picture is? It's a midterm election, and he's way down in favor of it.
Yeah, this is a big challenge for him because this is where your individual support could move that line up or down, where again still it's following presidential, but it could move up or down some. So Senator Johnson had relatively positive favorable and unfavorable ratings in 2019. They edged down for a while and then they moved down a bit more sharply over the last year or so. So he's net negative on that. There's still 21% that say they don't have an opinion of him. That's actually better than the 36 or 7% that it was recently, and it's about the same as Tammy Baldwin now. So, whereas Johnson has generally been sort of strikingly less known than Baldwin, they're actually at the same level now. In 2015, Johnson was also significantly underwater on the favorable and unfavorable and had what until recently was his lowest net ratings in the second half of 2015. But if you watched him in our data in the spring of 16, those favorable numbers got better and better and better. He was trailing Feingold, but from the midsummer through our last pre-election poll, the margin closed and closed again and closed again, so that by our final pre-election poll, we had it inside the margin of error. Feingold by 1, but a toss-up. Johnson ends up winning by just over 3. So I'm going to watch very carefully whether we see Johnson start to turn around those favorability numbers when we have living proof that he did it once before and against a very well-known opponent. The Democrat, whoever the nominee ends up being, is certainly going to be not as well-known initially, but then can they build not just recognition, but also a platform to really weaken Johnson in the campaign. And that Democrat and all Democrats will be working against the midterm slump for the President's Party that you mentioned. House seats have averaged losing, the President's Party have averaged losing 26 seats in every midterm since 1948. 26 seats would more than create a Republican majority. And given the President's job approval numbers right now, we would really expect something more like 35 seats. There's some caveats to that because the Democrats lost a lot of seats in 2020, so they don't have as many vulnerable and exposed seats as you might normally have in a midterm. But the Senate has been much more idiosyncratic. While on average the President's Party loses 2 to 6 Senate seats in a midterm with a lot of variation, there is a lot of variation, and so there is more of a chance for an idiosyncratic race to go against that kind of national trend. Stay tuned.
Yeah, kind of going off of what you were saying, the parallels between national and state politics. We've been so dominated by news of the pandemic, but we notice in the trends that you outlaid how concerns and how that's top of mind for voters kind of decreased over time. And I was wondering if you could kind of compare that to things like schools and education. And one of the questions was who should have more say in education for children, and how you see that playing out against each other moving forward.
Absolutely. One of the things, sometimes you can predict an issue is going to be big in the upcoming election. Other times it sort of comes quickly. I don't remember, I haven't gone back to look, but I don't remember the pre-existing conditions were the obvious issue for the 2018 campaign that they then became as we got into the race. Inflation looks like a better bet. So we have 68% saying they're very concerned about inflation. That's up from the 30s in the summer. So it's had a big move up. It's especially a concern to Republicans and a concern, but not as big one, for Democrats, which is also a good example of how your partisanship shapes the way you see the economy, right? We're all paying the same price at the pump, but Republicans say it's much more serious than Democrats do. They're clearly serving their political interests that way. But it's also what makes it a good issue for an opposition party to run on. Inflation's never a good issue for an incumbent president or an incumbent party, right? And there's precious little they can do to turn the dial to fix that problem. Whereas the opposition party can criticize loudly. And people at the pump or at the grocery store are feeling that. So I think inflation is clearly here. COVID, though, coronavirus, is one that's dropped a lot. Early in the pandemic, we had 8% were very concerned about it. That fell to 40 and then 50 and then 40, and now 27. That's the lowest concern of any of the four issues we asked about. And it makes sense with the dramatic fall in cases that we've seen in the month before the survey. Also, in our national polling, where we have all 50 states, we've looked to compare in what is the concern with coronavirus in your state. We've linked that to what the actual case rate in the state is. And sure enough, the states that were experiencing a high frequency of cases at the time of the survey, people expressed more concern. In the same survey, if your state had blessedly escaped the Omicron or Delta variant when those were moving, there was less concern. So it is clear that concern varies with the actual case rate. But then there is the question of COVID exhaustion, and are we just ready for it to be over, and so concern is some. There's again a partisan difference here. Democrats tend to exaggerate, or at least be more sensitive to their concern over COVID. Republicans tend to be more dismissive, but are less concerned. So again, a partisan divide there. The other two that we asked about were illegal immigration, which was in the 30s. But hasn't trended at all since the summer. It doesn't look like it's an explosive issue right now. And weirdly, unemployment is also in the mid-30s. We're very concerned when the state is at a record low 2.8% unemployment. So it's possible people have more fears about their own unemployment situation, but it's also likely that awareness that we really are at a 2.8% rate is not universal.
I have a broader question. Is polling broken, or is the public's perception of polling broken and the media's coverage of polling broken? That obviously refers to the miss in 2016.
At least one or two of those are broken, Bill. I'll let you figure out
Well,
what it is.
where do you think it's, where's polling going?
No, I think polling has non-trivial problems, serious problems in some cases. We saw a limited set of bad errors in 2016. Mine was one of those. With we had Clinton up by 6, and obviously she lost by a little under 1. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan were the 3 states that had systematic errors in 2016. But the national polling was pretty good, and the states generally weren't bad. But those were 3 pretty important mistakes to have. In 2018, though, we were mostly pretty good. Our last poll had the governor's race dead tied. Evers wins by 1, and we had Baldwin in 11, and she won by 10.9. So let's just stop talking about it at that point. In 2020, we had Biden leading by 5 among our expected likely electorate. We had him leading by 4 among a bigger turnout line. So we were off by either 3 or 4 points. Our average across all the races we've done since 2012 is a 2 percentage point error on the margin. So being off by 3 or 4 last time was worse than our average, but it was definitely better than that nearly 7-point error in 2016. there's a huge question in the polling community about whether Trump's presence on the ballot and the kinds of voters that he mobilizes produces an actual problem. That he's good at turning out folks to vote who haven't always voted, and those folks are also pretty skeptical of pollsters, and I might say the media. I don't need to tell you that. But that's presented a particular challenge in 2016 and 20. The fact that 2018 the polling was generally pretty good lends some support to that, but there's not a good way to prove it. One of the things that we do to check is, first of all, we check about our demographic balance and our partisan balance in each poll, and look at how, it's in the press release if you go down to the bottom. How our partisan balance in each poll matches up with the long run average balance. So you can kind of see if the poll is an outlier. We're sometimes going to have a poll that has too many dips or too many reps. That's just normal sampling error, but you don't want to see it way off. So we do that. The other thing that we started doing over the last 3 years is to look at the response rate county by county and look at the relationship between how those counties voted in the presidential race last time and what the response rate is. Are we getting too low a response rate for more Republican counties or too high from Democrats or vice versa? I'm happy to say, knock on wood, that so far for the last year and a half, we've not seen any appreciable correlation between the response rate and county vote. That doesn't guarantee we're okay. Maybe we're talking to the right percentage of Republicans, but maybe they're not the right kinds of Republicans. Right? If we're missing Trump Republicans, but we get the right percentage of Republicans, we're probably getting a little too many of the not so Trump members of the party. So those are the kinds of things that continue to keep me up at night. Not irritate, well, to keep me up at night. I don't think it amounts to being broken, though. When we compare our percentage from the survey that say they've been vaccinated with what the CDC says, we were exactly the same in August. By one measure, whether you're fully vaccinated, we were 2 points too low in October, and we were 2 points too high in having had any vaccination. We're a little low on vaccinations this time compared to the CDC by a point or two. So that's a good example where we have really up-to-date moving numbers from the government that we can compare and see how we're doing. So that's a very long answer to no. I don't think it's broken, but I think it faces real challenges, and this idea that certain types of people may be less willing to talk to us than was the case in the past is a big worry. It's something that it's not clear what you do to fix that, but it is something that you take into account and try to monitor and change practices if you can. Messages to get through to the public, that's a different kind of issue. You can write any story you want, but you can't make people read it or understand it or agree with it. And people have many, many sources of supposed information that, if it's congenial, will turn to it. Oddly enough, that's why they don't all embrace every result of the Marquette Law School Poll every time.
You talked about what keeps you up at night. I imagine for a politician in office, the misery index can keep a politician up, especially when a lot of people are not happy. And the misery index helps gauge where people are in terms of their economic situation and employment situation. But I'm curious, because you do a question about right direction, wrong direction. And 2 years ago, before the pandemic, Wisconsin voters, 61% believed the state was in the right direction. And then 2 years ago, it was 57%. A year ago, March, it was 61%. And this time around, it was at 39%. That's a big drop. So I have two questions for you. What is it that people are telling you when they say right direction and wrong direction? And then how does that play out for a governor who's trying to get reelected or a senator who's trying to get reelected?
There are somewhat differing views on this question. a lot of folks in the political polling world think it is a good indicator of whether an executive is facing good times or bad times. Mostly the president, but to some extent governors. There are others, and I'm more in this camp, say there are a lot of ways to rationalize good times and bad times, right? Especially if you can blame the other party for why we're off on the wrong track. So if you're a Democrat, you can blame the Republican legislature. You can say we're off on the wrong track. If you're a Republican, you can blame the Democratic governor and say we're off on the wrong track. So I do think there's some complications here. What we saw in national data is in the first half of 2021, right direction moved up substantially from where it had been during 2020. And I don't mean gigantically high, but net positive through the first half. But then at the end of the summer, we saw it turn sharply down to where it is now, here in the state and elsewhere. And I think you put together the Afghanistan withdrawal, which got such a large amount of criticism, even though it was a foreign event, not something close to home. But then you also got, after vaccines came out and after cases fell so very low in June and July, you got Delta. And so things started looking a lot worse, and then we got a brief respite from Delta before we got Omicron. And so I think those things have played a big role. And then finally, on the economic side, inflation starts to rise over the summer. It's been running at that 7-ish% range for a while now. And I'd remind you that, we haven't had this for 40 years. That means there are fully 2 generations out there that didn't live through high rates of inflation ever. And so how are they adjusting to it? And especially energy prices are up. And that's one of that, along with food, is the classic places that people encounter higher prices. So I think, there's some real world things driving that.
So let me just ask you about that, because when people look at inflation, unemployment, I mean, the state right now, unemployment, record low. So you would think good direction. Inflation, obviously not going in the right direction. Are you specifically asking people in that question? I know that the polling says right direction, wrong direction. But what are you hearing when you ask that question?
We do not prime it for what is in your mind. And in fact, we ask that question in the survey before we go through the laundry list of policy issues. So we don't want to prime people by asking them that question immediately after the inflation question, for example. So it's both a strength and a weakness that it's an undefined sense of good times or bad times. It doesn't matter a whole lot how you ask the question. Gallup asks the question of how do you think things are going in the country right now, well or poorly? And they see the same kind of thing without the right direction, wrong track kind of distinction. If you ask people what specifically they're worried about, there you get a much bigger plethora of things. I haven't looked it up this month, but I looked it up last month. Of all the times Gallup has asked the most important problem facing the country question from 2020 till now, each Gallup poll. Now that's an open-ended question. It doesn't give any guidance on what you mean by that. Well, the economy, undefined, almost always is at or near the top. But government and the problems of bad leadership is at 20-something% now. And then inflation, as of last summer, was at 0 or 1%. It's now at 8% that spontaneously mentioned inflation. So that gives you a sense that inflation, when I ask how concerned are you about inflation, we get 68% say very concerned. But when Gallup just asks, what are you worried about? Inflation's there. It's like the 3rd or 4th highest thing, but it's still below 10%. Then you look and there is just a long laundry list of problems that are in single digits. So it takes a crisis to move something way up. except for the economy, which is sort of always a ready problem in people's minds. And so people tend to say the economy, except in really good times. So in the late 90s, when the economy was humming along and had been for a long time, we started to see other issues become more important than the economy. Healthcare in that period. They stopped. Yes, you get it.
One of the sexier headlines that came out of yesterday had to do with marijuana, and we saw kind of a big shift there. And something that I talked about earlier about, you know, who you're reaching out to when it comes to Republicans. I kind of want to see if you can kind of dive into that a little more about, you know, do you think that's reflective? Are you guys asking things differently? What do you guys learn over that period of time? Because this is one of those the largest sets of data that you guys do have about this single issue. What have you learned? Has anything changed that indicates to you that there may be a significant shift?
We've asked about marijuana in a variety of different formats and question wordings. In the release, I focused on one phrasing that we had used consistently. The short takeaway is that using the common same question, there's been a steady rise in support for legalization from something like 41-52, I think it was, in early 2014, to a solid majority in favor in this latest poll. But when you look at it within the party, Republican support for legalization was only 29% in 2014, and it hit 51% the first time we've seen a Republican majority in favor in this poll. Independents are more in favor, Democrats much more. But all three groups have moved up by 20 or more points over that period. Now, if you ask about medical marijuana, which we've asked about once or twice, it's like 80-something% support, very, very high. For a while, we asked a question phrased in terms of legalize and regulate like alcohol. It turned out that that didn't produce any difference in the response than when we just asked, should marijuana be made legal? One poll, we split the sample into two and asked it one way and the other way, and we found there was just no difference in the responses. So it doesn't seem like that additional framing of, you know, regulate like alcohol was doing anything to affect the responses. And then some people have asked about and tax it to produce revenue, that sort of stuff. The national picture has been moving to more and more support as well in public opinion polls. But here in the state, we've certainly not seen legislation move very far on it.
I know I keep twisting while we're going in a straight line. How do you become a pollster? And is there a line of people wanting to be pollsters?
Oh, it's a really long line. It's great. Geez, Bill. Well, it helps if you're a little twisted. I did my first survey in the 10th grade. I interviewed 2nd, 4th, and 6th graders about their preferences for Saturday morning cartoons. And the theory was that the younger ones would like the more anthropomorphized rabbits and bunnies and, you know, things. And as you got older, there would be more of a taste for the kinds of things I liked in the 10th grade. Johnny Quest and other kind of things. None of you are old enough to know that. So it was a brilliant bit of research, collected on sheets of paper and tallied by making little hash marks. So I was pretty sick from the beginning. And, you know, first semester of college, I had a fantastic government professor, Irvin Penfield, who became my advisor and mentor and told me I would go to Michigan or he would break my knees. So yeah, I was, you know, growing up in a political environment at that time certainly made a big difference in being interested in politics, but I also liked science, and I found thinking about public opinion and ways to measure that and understand it fit well with blending the political and the social science side.
I know the answer to this, but the audience probably doesn't. Could you talk about growing up in the place and time you did and how that has influenced you?
Sure. Well, yeah, I grew up in the segregated South in the 50s and 60s in Alabama. during the height of the civil rights movement. George Wallace was my governor most of that time. Grew up in the 11th most heavily black county in the country and the 17th poorest county in the country. Couldn't live through that without having some feelings. I will give a lot of credit to the Methodist Church for setting how my life evolved during that time. But, you know, politics just sort of surrounded you in that time, and the morality of it surrounded you. I very rarely take any kind of political stand, but coming out of that, my sense that the denial of voting rights in that period was the biggest assault on a voting fraud in the country, and I think giving people the right to vote is so fundamental to our society that that's the one thing that I'll get up on a soapbox and talk a little bit about. But college and graduate school also really emphasized the importance of, if you want to be the scientist type, one person once called me a mad scientist type as a pollster, and I thought, I asked the dean if he could get that put on my door as my name tag, you know, Charles Franklin, mad scientist. But I actually like the title because it's a struggle to see the world, see politics as clearly as you can. And that means setting aside whatever your personal preferences are in order to understand that and to represent it fairly. And I don't always succeed in that, but I try. This issue of voter turnout is one of the areas that I think is one that is important to me out of my background, not to mention the issues of race and equality that also came so vividly from that time.
So given that background, you have also been polling lately on confidence in the accuracy of the 2020 election. We know Republicans' confidence in that, I don't believe, has reached majority status since you started polling on this. Democrats have been in the 90s. But I did notice in this last poll a shift from independents to having a high confidence to now almost in the middle. What are you observing on that? And I don't know if you can put it into some historical context of what we just saw here in the city of Milwaukee, where we don't get to elect a new mayor very often. And we just had a primary where 1 out of 4 registered voters showed up. So I didn't know if you can put those two, I know you don't poll locally, but if there's some sort of historical context of what you're seeing.
The turnout in Milwaukee wasn't all that different from some of the previous turnouts, so in that sense, it's neither unusually high nor low. On the other hand, given how rarely we have a new mayor or an open seat for mayor, it is kind of striking. You know, one of the mysteries in a sort of purely rational sense is why we don't participate more in local elections that might affect us more directly, and why our choices might have more of an effect. But we all get really excited about this distant presidential race. But that's true, you know, and you can obviously see some reasons why that is, but it's still kind of an issue that, you know, local things where we could have more of an impact consistently have the lower levels of turnout. Shift on independence, on confidence, really. 2 things. One is independents in our sample in August were pretty solidly confident in the election outcome. And they became less confident in October. There really wasn't a change from October to now, but it's more like 55% confident instead of 60-something percent, 65 I think it was in August. So there has been a shift there. That's a small group of people, I'll have to say. What was more striking to me is that among Republicans, there's been a modest but consistent increase in confidence and decline in doubt about the election. It's gone from about 70% doubtful to about 60% doubtful. So it's still a majority, even a solid majority of Republicans that say they have little or no confidence in the election result. But it is moving in a direction counter to what you might expect given developments in the governor's race and the Gableman investigation and so on. So I think that's interesting and worth watching. In the broader picture, until this poll, at least, I would have said that among Republicans, it's about 2/3 skeptical, 1/3 confident. Among the public at large, it's almost exactly the flip of that, 2/3 confident, 1/3 skeptical. So you can see the dilemma of the Republican Party that among the partisans, there's this huge majority of skeptics. But in a general election electorate, the balance would flip the exact opposite way. Now, some of that's because Democrats are over 95% confident in the election outcome. There's obviously a self-serving partisan motivation in seeing all of that. But I do think as an issue that's dividing the GOP in the primary as well as in the legislature, this is an important development to track about whether this shifts at all and how it plays out. And whether, like I said, the independents became more skeptical, though a majority confident, and have stayed that way. I don't know if they're shifting again after this poll, because really we only have 3 bites of that apple at this point.
And kind of going off of that with the confidence in the 2020 election, looking at the favorability for former President Donald Trump, and then one that may sort of be related is Representative Grantham. In his view, in the Republican primary, do you kind of see that as a losing of juice and the power of Trump as Grantham has kind of framed himself as the Trump candidate overall?
Yeah, I think one of the things we're following in both the state polling and the national polling is the question of what's happening within the Republican Party. It's pretty much unprecedented for a former president to continue to play as big a role in day-to-day party politics after they've left office. So we really don't have a historical standard to compare to. But the divisions over the 2020 election and Donald Trump's positions on that and the coronavirus have all kind of kept him centrally located within the party. What I think is happening this year, here in Wisconsin and nationally, is you're having Republican primaries that are competitive among a number of candidates with differing connections to President Trump. How are those going to play out? Because it's one thing to be pro-Trump or anti-Trump Republican, but you're sure anti-Democrat. Now the fight is within the party. How do these tensions get played out within the parties? And there's some sense of what happens in the fall, but just within the party there's a competition here, and I'm just trying to follow it and see. Views of President Trump are still very positive in the Republican Party, but the percent who say they'd like him to run for president, again, this is national data, favorability to him 74%, wanting to run again 63%. This is not a collapse of support by any stretch of the imagination, but it does show a gap there. We also, in the national data in January, pitted Biden against Trump and Biden against Ron DeSantis. And Ron DeSantis ran a couple of points better than Trump in those matchups against Biden. So the point there is there are other Republicans that can perform at least as well as Trump. And what role does that play in how the party starts to see their next nominee? I want to watch that this year for the midterms, but obviously looking ahead to 2024 and the evolution of the party over time. Democrats have another flip, an obvious issue between the most progressive wing and the centrist wing.
Based on the historical numbers, when do you anticipate voters will focus on the August primary? September or July?
Yeah, September's probably right. listen, 2018, the governor's race on the Democratic side is sort of the best benchmark we have because it also had a big field of candidates. And in July, we still saw most of those candidates being recognized or understood by less than 50% of the electorate. Now, among the primary voters, especially in a hot race for the top 2 or 3 positions, you get more knowledge, but it does tend to build in June and July, not in February or April even. So I expect we will see limited knowledge of the candidates. I think the folks that are going to break out will start to break out over the summer. And the folks that just don't have the resources to wage a high-end media campaign will just sort of stay unknown. A somewhat related thing on enthusiasm to vote, some of the national polling is showing a difference between Democrats and Republicans. We're actually not seeing a difference here in the state at this point. So it doesn't look like there's an advantage to one party or the other at the moment, based on either attention to politics or professed enthusiasm to vote this year.
And I have a quick follow-up. What was the most intriguing number of the others that came out of this poll that maybe we overlooked?
Well, I think the questions about education as an issue are right up there. The question of who should set curriculum in schools, 35% parents, 33% teachers, but I think it was 19 superintendents and, or 19 school boards and something less than that, 9 or 10 superintendents. Only 5% thought legislators should set the curriculum. One of the questions, and I've said this several times in the last 24 hours, is most of us, me included, don't really have a clear idea of how curricula are set. What are the points of input that parents can have? What role do school boards formally have? After all, they're elected bodies. That's the sort of natural democratic input, small d democratic input to these things. So it's an issue that blew up in the Virginia governor's race, and we're seeing sharp party differences among Republicans. 53% say parents should have the most to say, and among Democrats, it's 56% say teachers should have the most say. Not really a surprise there. Independents, though, are on balance. 40-something% say parents should have the say. 30-something, 20-something% say parents should. So, I'm sorry, say teachers should. So independents leaning a little more on the Republican direction on that. But I think this is an issue that, education is a hardy perennial. It's an issue that comes up every budget cycle. Sometimes some substantive issues involved, but the development of using critical race theory as a political issue for Republicans last year, then the Virginia race with Youngkin and McAuliffe arguing about whether parents should have a say. These are ripe for political use, and I'm pretty confident that they'll grow. Also, the question of school vouchers. That had been more opposed than in favor when we asked the question in 2020, I believe it was. And this time, it's a sizable majority, about 56% or so, I think, were in favor of vouchers. Now, warning is that how you ask that question matters. We in the past have asked a version that said, what about if vouchers took away funding for your local public school? Well, not surprisingly, that produces more doubts. We've also asked the questions about whether you think vouchers hurt the quality of public schools by skimming away better students. So who knew that education is complicated? And even though we're going to be asking 3 or 4 or 5 questions about education in basically every survey, still trying to cover the range of views is tricky. In October, for example, we asked, how satisfied are you with the public schools in your community? That's a question we've asked repeatedly. Over 60, I think it was pushing 65%, said they were satisfied or very satisfied with their schools in their community. And that's something we've seen pretty repeatedly over time. But in this survey, we asked whether schools have gotten better, stayed the same, or gotten worse over the last 2 years. Most people said gotten worse, and that number was worse than when we asked it in 18 was the last time. So there does seem to be a growing negativity on that form of the question, even as this 60-something% said they were satisfied in their community. I think there is a bit there that my schools are fine, but your schools suck. It's something else to worry about and watch on that.
In a few minutes, we're going to ask you guys to ask the questions, so just hold on a few more minutes. We've got some questions here. Yesterday was an interesting day. We had President Biden in the state, and he was in Superior, Wisconsin with Senator Baldwin and Governor Evers, or Evers, as he likes to pronounce it. And I was...
As somebody that has to ask that question on surveys, there's
Yes.
a phonetic pronunciation on the survey
and
to help our interviewers.
Right, yeah. Apparently they have not inserted that.
President Biden didn't get called
No,
by,
exactly.
so he didn't learn.
But I was fascinated by the poll that came out that day that showed the most popular, at least favorable guy in the room was Governor Evers at 50% in your poll. That was sort of a wow moment for me. Not a big difference. I mean, Biden's at 43%, Senator Baldwin at 42%. But I'm curious on your thought, if you were to look and hark back to the days of Tommy Thompson, who seemed to win elections, by so, yeah. So have you noticed that people just don't, a majority of people just don't love or favor our politicians? And was there a turning point for you in the polling that you watched for why that changed?
Yeah, the biggest shift started in the 90s, but really accelerated in the 2000s. I'm mostly talking about national data, but it seems likely here too. As people became no more favorable to their own party, but became much more negative to the opposite party, the opposition party. So that has brought down overall favorability or approval ratings because now there's a big segment of the public from the other party that doesn't like the president no matter who that is, right? And they'll flip, of course, when the party controlling the presidency changes. And what we see with that in the approval numbers are that, excuse me, in the 90s with Clinton, he was consistently getting approval from Republicans in the 20s and 30s during most, not all, but most of his term. So obviously not big approval, but approval. With President Bush, you have to set aside the 9/11, post 9/11, when all partisans became much more positive. But by the second term of Bush, Democrats had fallen below 10% and did not move the rest of his term. Independents and Republicans both came down in the second term as first the wars went badly and then the Great Recession hit. So Democrats were already down there on the floor and couldn't move any lower, but Republicans and Independents kind of moved in a normal way that bad times brought down their approval rate. But in the Obama term and then in the Trump term, we saw that the opposite party was at 10% or below the whole time. And it didn't really matter that the economy was recovering through the 8 years of Obama. Republicans didn't give him any more credit. When we killed Osama bin Laden, there was no bump in approval from Republicans who presumably favored that outcome. With Trump, it's just the opposite. Democrats were less than 10% and stayed there no matter what happened. And the partisans have tended to be pretty high, maybe even higher than usual, though there has been some slippage to some extent with Trump, a little more slippage with Biden, so there's a little movement there. But I think this negative partisanship is the term of art, that people like their party okay, but they really dislike the other party is a big part of that. What Tommy did and what Herb Cole did was win substantial votes from the other party. And it's kind of hard to imagine that happening now. Glenn Youngkin in Virginia was the good example of a Republican who showed real sympathy for the Trump base of the party without having to embrace Trump literally or figuratively. And that paid off for him. Youngkin outperformed Trump in the reddest parts of Virginia. And he made significant inroads while still losing, but significant inroads in suburban Virginia. So I think he's a kind of a role model of how do you continue to appeal to the Trump base, but not lose support because you're too Trumpy in a general election. And as I say, the primaries this year will be fun to see how they play out.
Thank you.
Don't go anywhere yet.
Oh, no.
Do we have audience questions? Okay, go ahead.
A technical question as a poll pollster. How is it that you select your sample?
Sure. So for our Wisconsin polls, we call by telephone with live interviewers. We draw a sample of area codes and exchanges throughout the state for both cell phone and landline. And we also draw a sample of cell phone numbers that have moved into the state but have an out-of-state area code. So I've given my research fellow a hard time because he kept his Chicago area code, and I said we could never get him on the phone when he called. He's now in our sample. I should say that number was trivially small when we started the poll. It was like 5% at most. It's about 16% of numbers in the state now that are what we call out-of-area numbers. And so we're now covering those as well. That's an adjustment that we've made as those out-of-area numbers have grown in significance. So we then attach a random 4-digit number to that so that every working number, whether it's a landline or a cell, gets an equal chance of being selected into the sample. And we call them back up to 4 times trying to get through. Now, people, as you know, don't answer their numbers, so we have to dial a lot of numbers. For the 800 respondents last time, this week we drew a sample of 58,000 numbers. And we ended up with a response rate of 3.6%. That's in the methodology statement, if anybody's crazy enough to look. So that's the method we use for that. With the national study, we're using a new method that's really interesting. You can go to the post office of all people and buy a list of every address in the country they deliver mail to, for a fee, of course. Then you draw a random sample of those addresses, stratified so you're representing all the parts of the country, and then you send them a US mail envelope saying, here's a letter, we invite you to take part in surveys for us. If you agree to do it, we will send you an email from time to time inviting you to do a survey. The advantage of that is it also gives a random sample of an equal chance of every address in the country to be selected. And to go back to Bill's broken question, the problem, of course, is we can't make them respond. And so you're still faced with the problem that not everybody responds, whether it's on the phone or to that survey. Historically, it hadn't mattered much because Democrats and Republicans alike hated telemarketing calls or scam calls. So while you didn't get as many people answering the phone, it didn't introduce a party bias. On picking up, it still doesn't look like there's a party bias, but the big worry is that Democrats or Republicans might be more or less willing to respond either to an individual survey. Say the president had a really bad night, and then you go in the field and do a survey. Democrats might be less willing to talk to you. At another time, it might be the Republicans that are less likely. So those are the kinds of issues. But that's how we do it.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for being here today.
Sure.
I haven't had an opportunity to review the poll yet.
Yeah.
My bad.
But I'm curious, on an open-ended question, in terms of what was bothering, trying to say it a little differently, but I didn't hear the word crime at all.
Right.
And I'm wondering, is that at the bottom end of your,
No.
your single digits?
Right. Let me be clear. We didn't ask about crime, and we didn't ask an open-ended question this time. Gallup asked the most important question that's open-ended. We have done questions in the past that used an open-ended format. You get the same kind of wide variety of things. We asked about crime in October, I believe it was, and it had a fairly high level of concern. But obviously, the Waukesha parade has happened in the meantime, and shootings here and elsewhere in the state. We will not ignore the crime issue, but I just didn't have room for it. And I thought inflation and comparing that to unemployment was important. We had asked about immigration, illegal immigration earlier, and I wanted to get a track on that. And then finally, COVID has been changing. It's not that we're ignoring crime, it's just that it didn't make it into this survey. Let me say, we try to do a few things that we ask every time, like presidential job approval, or Ever's job approval. Then we have some that we revisit frequently, but not every survey. These examples would hold for that. And then there's some that we try to touch maybe once a year, like opinion on abortion, for example. There's not a lot of change in that view, but we like to keep it fresh. And the marijuana is an example too, where we ask it maybe once a year or so. So that's what happens, but oddly enough, folks won't stay on the phone for my hour and a half worth of questions, so I got to do it in 15 minutes, and that's where the issue went. We're not forgetting it, though.
Yes, sir.
Charles, question for you within your poll. You know, it was the MSMs, Cross, Eau Claire, Wausau, Green Bay Market. Can you break down? So it spiked to 42%. Is he at 58 Madison, 60 in Milwaukee, and bottom fell out in Green Bay, or
Right.
where is
If you go to our website, ready to write it down? law.marquette.edu/poll, or just ask Google for Marquette poll. Excuse me. On the page for this poll's data, you'll see top lines and crosstabs. The top lines show you the answers to every question we asked. And the crosstab shows you those questions broken down by a bunch of demographics, one of which is what region of the state you live in. So you can go and look at that. I didn't notice that there were profound short-term changes in that, but there are obvious differences between the more Republican and the more Democratic parties. There's also at the top of that page two little tabs you can click on. One is called Interactive Top Lines, the other is Interactive Crosstabs. Those contain all, I think we're up to 1,800 questions we've ever asked. They're completely searchable by words. So if you search for gun, you'll find every question we've ever asked about guns. If you search for Medicare or Medicaid, you'll find all of those. And with a couple of clicks, you can see the results for every time we've asked that question. You can see the trend, and that way you can find it yourself easily. And likewise for the crosstabs, you can check a variety of demographic crosstabs, and again, every question we've ever asked is in that database. And it's updated as soon as the release is out every day. So we posted this at about 1 o'clock yesterday. Yesterday's release. But these crosstabs and top lines were updated immediately as well. So another source we're going to find these things.
Jim?
Thanks for being here. Quick question. In your survey, one of the candidates, or maybe not a candidate, you didn't ask about is Tommy Thompson.
Yeah.
What do you think you would have found had you asked?
I came this.
And why didn't you ask?
No, I understand. I came this close to asking because I share the curiosity.
Sure.
And we've not asked about him since 2012 when he ran for the Senate. So it would be interesting to update it. My hesitancy was he's not make clear what his intentions are, and I don't think my job is to check the temperature for a potential candidate. So I did not include him in the survey because of that. If he says he's absolutely not going to run in April, then we might ask about it some other time, because I'm interested in it. But he needs to either put himself in the race, in which case we'll obviously ask about him as a candidate, or he needs to take himself clearly out of the race, and then I'll be free to ask about it. But, you know, we saw so many people don't know the candidates that are in the race. It also seems not quite right to ask about somebody that's as well known as Tommy is when he's not, when he gives these tantalizing hints. But yeah, says wait till April.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. I don't believe the issue was covered in this poll, but concern over climate change, is that something
Yes.
you ever poll on?
Yeah, we've asked about it several times, not real recently, but it's one of those that we should refresh from time to time. You know, we found moderately high levels of concern. At one time, we asked about it in relationship to carbon offsets, back when that was a lively issue. We've not asked a question that's just sheer concern, like the inflation question, how concerned are you about it? But it's certainly worth coming back to. Climate change and some of the other issues are, school vouchers is a good example of this. The policy debate has shifted over time, so it's kind of hard to find a way to ask the question that is relevant to the different times you ask it, right? So being concerned about climate change is actually an easy one to ask consistently over time, but it's not very specific. If we ask about carbon offsets or carbon pricing exchanges, that issue becomes viable at some point and then it disappears for a while. Doesn't make much sense to ask it in that way. With vouchers, we've asked questions about the initial expansion beyond the Milwaukee area. Then we asked it about the enrollment caps in voucher schools. Now we're asking about just expanding it generally. And the bad news is it means they're not strictly comparable over time because the issue itself changes.
Yes, sir, in the back.
Professor, there were bills introduced in Madison this last year in seeking to move to a Final Five voting for federal races in Wisconsin, not presidential, but the congressional and Senate. Has Marquette Poll asked about Final Five voting reform yet?
We have not. Well, legislature's going home now, right? These are kinds of things that I'm happy to ask about from time to time, but they need to build a level of visibility to be very helpful, I think. We've asked several things about redistricting in the state, for example. This has been a major issue this year. But we're still finding high percentages of people who say they haven't followed the redistricting issue at all. That doesn't make it an unimportant question. And when we've asked if people would like partisan districting redistricting done by the governor and the legislature or redistricting by a nonpartisan commission, 80% say they want nonpartisan districting, even as half say they're not really following redistricting very much. So my point is, it's not something that we can ask about, top five easily enough, but we need to understand that a lot of people don't know what that is. If I just said Final Five, they'd say March Madness.
Yeah.
And if we explain it to them, then it may well be that respondents only know the explanation we gave them about the issue. And so it's a real tricky thing to ask that question without biasing it in some way. So I would love it if the legislature would heatedly debate it, if it would be in the news a lot, and then it would make sense to ask people what their opinions are about it. But these kinds of election reforms have been increasingly popular around the country. A number of states have adopted some variation of them. The details differ. But I think a vigorous debate about them would be good, and if that becomes public in a fairly visible way, I'd be happy to be asking questions about it.
Charles Franklin, thank you so much for being here. elections. On March 16th, we will be at Turner Hall with the mayoral candidates. We're hosting with the Journal Sentinel and with the Pabst Theater Group, so please come join us. It starts at 6 o'clock. Also, I want to thank the Newsroom Pub for always hosting us, and WisPolitics.com, UW Milwaukee, The Energy, Spectrum News 1, and everyone else. So thank you guys for being here. Have a good day.